The unexpected encounter. The crisp autumn air carried a quiet chill as Henry Winston's sleek black Mercedes glided to a stop in front of La Table Royale, the most exclusive restaurant in the city's financial district. The chauffeur, dressed in a sharp black suit, hurried around to open the door, his movements as precise as the luxury timepiece on Henry's wrist. As Henry stepped onto the sidewalk, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored charcoal suit, his sharp gray eyes scanned the area. The city lights flickered in the evening dusk, reflecting off the towering glass buildings that lined the street. Everything about this moment was predictable: his weekly Thursday dinner, the respectful nods from the valet, the restaurant's double doors swinging open at his arrival. Inside, the maitre d' greeted him with the same polished smile. "Good evening, Mr. Winston. Your table is ready." Henry offered a slight nod in return, walking with an air of quiet authority. The restaurant's patrons, CEOs, hedge fund managers, and social elites, glanced his way, some with admiration, others with envy. His presence was undeniable. Henry Winston wasn't just another businessman, he was a self-made billionaire, a man who had built an empire with ruthless efficiency. His usual table, nestled in a quiet corner behind an elegant partition of frosted glass, awaited him. He adjusted his chair exactly 2 inches to the left before settling in. The white linen napkin unfolded smoothly across his lap, and as always, his first glance was at his platinum watch. 7:05 p.m. exactly on schedule. He was a man of habit. Everything in his life ran on precision, from the stocks he invested in to the meals he consumed. Even his drink was predetermined, a 25-year-aged Macallan, served neat. The restaurant hummed with the soft murmur of business deals and quiet laughter. Henry let out a slow breath, glancing at the floor-to-ceiling windows. That's when he saw it. Across the street, near the entrance of a dimly lit alley, a small figure huddled against the cold brick wall. A boy, no older than 10, dressed in tattered clothes that barely covered his thin frame. His arms were wrapped around himself, trying to fight the chill of the evening air. Henry frowned slightly. The financial district wasn't a place where homeless people lingered for long, security usually saw to that. And yet, there he was. Something about the sight unsettled him. He had seen beggars before, but there was something different about this boy. The way he sat still, his head bowed, his small frame trembling, there was no desperation in him, no outstretched hand begging for loose change. Just quiet endurance. "Your drink, sir." The waiter's voice broke his train of thought. Henry blinked and turned back to his table. The drink was set before him, precisely as he liked it. He nodded in thanks, but his mind was elsewhere. "Why do I care?" He tried to shake the feeling, but his eyes drifted back toward the window. The boy hadn't moved. For reasons he couldn't explain, Henry raised a hand, calling over the maitre d'. "That boy outside," he said, nodding toward the alley. "Bring him in." The maitre d' hesitated. This was not the type of request Henry Winston usually made. But in a place where billionaires were kings, no one questioned a command. "Right away, sir." A minute later, the restaurant doors swung open again. The sudden rush of cold air sent a ripple through the warm, refined atmosphere. The boy stepped inside hesitantly, eyes darting around the lavish interior. The golden chandeliers, the crisp white tablecloths, the aroma of gourmet cuisine, it was all foreign to him. A waiter attempted to escort him forward, but the boy instinctively flinched away from the touch. Henry noticed the reaction and gestured for the staff to give him space. The boy's gaze finally met Henry's. His eyes were deep brown, intelligent but guarded, like someone who had learned not to trust too easily. "What's your name?" Henry asked, his voice measured. The boy swallowed hard before answering, "Elijah." Henry gestured toward the empty seat across from him. "Sit." Elijah hesitated for a long moment before cautiously pulling out the chair. He perched on the edge, stiff and alert, like a stray dog expecting to be chased away. A waiter hovered nearby, awaiting Henry's order. "Bring him something warm," Henry said. "Something filling." The waiter nodded and hurried off. Silence stretched between them. Elijah's fingers twitched on the edge of the table, his gaze darting between Henry and the expensive decor around them. "You're homeless," Henry stated, not as a question, but as an observation. Elijah looked down. "Yeah. How long?" The boy shifted uncomfortably. "Couple years. Since I was little." Henry leaned back in his chair, studying him. "A couple of years?" That meant Elijah had been surviving on the streets since he was no older than 5 or 6. That kind of life hardened people, forced them to grow up too quickly. The waiter returned with a steaming plate of food, thick soup, warm bread, and roasted chicken. The scent alone made Elijah's stomach growl. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the silverware. Henry raised an eyebrow. "It's not poisoned." Elijah gave him a cautious look before grabbing the spoon. The first bite was slow, testing. Then the second came faster, then the third. Within minutes, he was eating like a boy who hadn't had a real meal in days. Henry watched in silence, something tightening in his chest. Why am I doing this? He had built his empire with logic and control, never making a decision based on impulse. But something about Elijah stirred a memory buried deep in his past, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to dwell on in years. "Where are your parents?" he asked. Elijah's chewing slowed. His expression darkened. "Gone." Henry's jaw tightened. He didn't press further. The rest of the meal passed in silence. When Elijah finally put his spoon down, his posture was less rigid, his exhaustion more apparent now that his hunger was sated. Henry knew he should dismiss the boy now, go back to his carefully structured life. It was just one meal. Just one act of charity. But as he looked at the boy, thin, worn down, yet still filled with quiet resilience, he found himself speaking words that surprised even him. "Elijah," he said slowly, "how would you like to come home with me?" Elijah's eyes widened. "You serious?" Henry leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I don't offer things I don't mean." Elijah studied him carefully, searching for the trick, the condition. "Why?" Henry didn't know the answer himself. But something deep inside him whispered, "Because I know what it's like to be alone." And for the first time in a long, long while, Henry Winston acted not out of logic, but out of something far more human. That night, neither of their lives would ever be the same. A new life begins. The drive home was silent. Henry Winston's black Mercedes glided smoothly through the city streets, the soft hum of the engine the only sound between him and Elijah. The boy sat stiffly in the back seat, his small hands clenched together in his lap. His thin, oversized jacket was patched and frayed, barely offering warmth. The dim glow of streetlights flashed across his wary eyes, and every so often, he would glance at Henry with a mix of confusion and suspicion. Henry pretended not to notice. He was just as uncertain about what he was doing. This was not how he lived his life. Everything he did was calculated, precise, and planned. Yet tonight, he had done something impulsive. And for the first time in years, he didn't regret it. The sleek car pulled up to a private estate on the outskirts of the city. The wrought iron gates opened automatically, revealing a vast mansion that loomed over perfectly manicured lawns and a grand circular driveway. Elijah's fingers tightened around his worn sleeves as he took in the sight. The house, if you could even call it that, looked more like a palace, its large windows glowing warmly in the night. "This is your house?" Elijah murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry didn't answer. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his coat as the chauffeur hurried over to open the door for Elijah. The boy hesitated. His instinct told him to run. This was too much too strange, but his stomach was still full from the meal, and something in Henry's demeanor made him stay. Inside, the house was even grander. The floors gleamed beneath chandeliers, and modern artwork lined the walls. Everything was pristine, expensive, and perfectly in place, except for the small boy standing in the middle of it all, looking like he didn't belong. "Mr. Winston?" A voice echoed from the marble staircase. An older woman, dressed in professional black attire, walked toward them. She had sharp eyes and a strict posture, though a flicker of surprise crossed her face when she noticed Elijah. "This is Margaret," Henry said, glancing at the boy. "She manages the house." Margaret folded her hands in front of her. "Good evening, sir. Will this guest be staying the night?" Henry exhaled, rubbing his temple. "He'll be staying indefinitely." Margaret's brows lifted ever so slightly, but she was too well trained to question her employer. Instead, she nodded once. "I will prepare a room." Elijah's head snapped up. "A room?" "Yes," Henry said simply. "You'll be staying here now." The boy blinked as if trying to process the words. He had spent years sleeping on sidewalks, beneath bridges, or in abandoned buildings. A room wasn't something he could wrap his mind around. "Come with me," Margaret said, her tone firm but not unkind. Elijah hesitated, glancing at Henry. The billionaire met his gaze, and for the first time that night, a small, almost imperceptible nod passed between them. "It's okay." Elijah followed Margaret up the grand staircase, his thin shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor. She led him down a hallway, stopping at a large wooden door before pushing it open. Inside, the room was massive. A king-sized bed, neatly made with crisp white sheets, sat against one wall. A desk, a reading chair, and even a fireplace added to the luxury. Across the room, a floor-to-ceiling window overlooked the city skyline. Elijah didn't move. "This is for me?" Margaret studied him, noting the way his hands gripped his ragged sleeves. "Yes." She walked over to a closet and pulled out a set of fresh clothes, simple but comfortable. "There's a bathroom through that door," she said. "You can take a shower. If you need anything, ring the bell by the door." Elijah stared at her as if she were speaking another language. A bathroom? A bell? These were things rich people had, not kids like him. Margaret sighed, softening just a little. "Just get cleaned up. I'll have food brought up." With that, she left him alone. For several minutes, Elijah didn't move. His mind screamed at him that this wasn't real, that at any moment, someone would throw him back onto the streets. He walked over to the bed, pressing his fingers against the soft blankets. "It's real." Cautiously, he stepped into the bathroom. The mirror above the sink reflected a small, thin boy with dirt-streaked skin and hollow cheeks. He looked like a stranger to himself. The shower was a miracle. Hot water poured over him, washing away layers of grime he hadn't even realized were there. His muscles relaxed, and for the first time in years, he felt clean. By the time he stepped out, wearing the fresh clothes Margaret had left, his eyelids felt heavy. He barely made it to the bed before exhaustion overtook him. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he slept in warmth. The morning after. Henry Winston was already awake when the first rays of sunlight filtered through the large windows of his home office. He sat at his desk, scanning the latest financial reports, but his mind wasn't fully on work. He had done something unusual last night, something out of character. And now, in the harsh light of morning, he wondered what exactly he had gotten himself into. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Margaret stepped inside, her hands folded neatly. "The boy is awake." Henry nodded, setting down his papers. "How did he sleep?" "Like a child who hasn't had a real bed in years," she said simply. "He was startled when he woke up. I think he thought it was a dream. Henry exhaled, leaning back in his chair. And now? Margaret's lips pressed together. Now, he's waiting. He doesn't know what to do next. Henry closed his eyes for a brief moment before standing. I'll talk to him. Elijah sat at the grand dining table, staring at the plate in front of him. Scrambled eggs, toast, and fruit. Everything looked fresh, too perfect, too good to be meant for him. He hadn't touched it. Henry walked in, taking his usual seat across the long table. He glanced at the untouched plate. Not hungry? Elijah shifted uncomfortably. I don't eat here. Henry frowned. You do now. A tense silence stretched between them. Finally, Elijah hesitantly picked up his fork and took a bite. His body, still unfamiliar with regular meals, reacted instantly, and before he knew it, he had eaten more than half the plate. Henry sipped his coffee, watching the boy carefully. He's still scared, still unsure. Finally, Henry set down his cup. Elijah. The boy looked up. You're staying here now, Henry said, his tone firm. You'll go to school, you'll eat, you'll sleep in a bed, and you won't have to worry about where your next meal is coming from. Elijah swallowed hard. Why? Henry's gaze didn't waver. Because I can. Elijah stared at him for a long time before whispering, what if I mess up? Henry leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Then we figure it out. For the first time, something in Elijah's guarded eyes flickered with something close to hope. He still didn't fully believe it. But maybe, just maybe, this wasn't too good to be true. The road to trust. The morning air was crisp as the city stretched awake, its streets slowly filling with cars, pedestrians, and the distant hum of life. Inside Henry Winston's mansion, however, time moved at a different pace. Elijah sat stiffly at the breakfast table, gripping the edge of his chair as though any sudden movement might shatter the fragile reality he had woken up to. The plate in front of him was half-eaten, but his appetite had faded, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty that refused to loosen its grip. Across from him, Henry sat with a newspaper in one hand and his coffee in the other. He didn't say much, he rarely did, but every once in a while, he would glance up, studying the boy as if trying to understand him. You need to eat, Henry finally said, setting his cup down. Elijah hesitated before picking at his food. The eggs were still warm, the toast crisp, the fruit fresh. Too fresh. It wasn't like the leftovers he used to scavenge or the stale bread he had traded for on the streets. It still didn't feel real. Henry exhaled, folding his newspaper. Come with me. Elijah tensed. Where? Henry didn't answer. He simply stood and gestured for the boy to follow. Elijah's heart pounded as he pushed his chair back and trailed behind Henry. The house was eerily quiet, the only sounds their footsteps against polished marble floors. Everything was pristine, expensive, and untouched, like a museum where nothing was meant to be lived in. They walked down a long corridor, past rows of closed doors, until Henry stopped before one and pushed it open. Elijah stepped inside cautiously. The room was unlike any other in the house. Sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating shelves filled with books, leather chairs, and a grand mahogany desk that looked like it had never known disorder. Henry walked over to a cabinet, unlocking it with a small key. He pulled out a sleek, dark blue folder and set it on the desk. Sit, he instructed. Elijah hesitated before perching on the edge of the chair across from Henry. The billionaire opened the folder, revealing neatly stacked papers with elegant lettering. This is an agreement, Henry began. I've started the process for adoption. Elijah's stomach dropped. The words echoed in his mind, but they felt distant, unreal. Adoption? Him? Henry watched him carefully. It's not finalized yet. It takes time. But if we move forward, this will be permanent. Elijah's hands balled into fists in his lap. His first instinct was to run, to get up and bolt out of this house, this life, this overwhelming reality. Permanent. That word had never existed for him before. Henry leaned back slightly, studying the boy's reaction. "I won't force this on you," he said after a moment. "You can leave at any time. But if you stay, I need you to understand that this isn't charity. You're not a guest here. You're not an outsider." Elijah swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Why me?" Henry didn't answer right away. Instead, he closed the folder, lacing his fingers together. His sharp, calculating eyes softened just a fraction. "Because I know what it's like to be alone." Elijah stiffened. He hadn't expected that. Henry rarely spoke about his past. The world saw him as a ruthless businessman, a self-made millionaire who had climbed his way to the top with an iron will and an unforgiving mindset. But behind that carefully curated image was a history not so different from Elijah's own. Henry had been abandoned, too. Not in the same way, perhaps, not on the streets, not in the cold, but he had been left behind, discarded by the people who were supposed to care for him. His father had walked out when he was 10. His mother, unable to handle the burden alone, had spiraled into addiction, leaving him to fend for himself in a house that felt more like a prison than a home. He had survived. Alone. And he had sworn that no one else would ever matter to him again. But then, this boy had appeared on a freezing night in the city, shivering in the shadows of a life no child should have to endure. And for the first time in decades, Henry had done something he hadn't planned. He had acted not as a businessman, not as a calculated strategist, but as a human being. Elijah's voice was barely above a whisper. "You don't even know me." Henry nodded. "Not yet." A long silence stretched between them. Elijah looked down at his hands, his mind a storm of emotions he didn't know how to process. For 7 years, he had survived by trusting no one, depending on nothing but himself. But now? Now, someone was offering him something no one ever had. A home. A future. A chance. Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "What if I mess up?" Henry didn't hesitate. "Then we figure it out." The words were the same as the night before, but somehow, they felt different now. Elijah looked up, searching Henry's face for any sign of hesitation, any indication that this was just another deal to him. But for once, the man who built an empire on negotiations and transactions wasn't bargaining. This wasn't about business. It was about family. And for the first time in his life, Elijah considered the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face the world alone anymore. The adjustment period. The days that followed were filled with changes. Margaret arranged for Elijah to have new clothes, not expensive suits like Henry's, but simple, comfortable pieces that actually fit. He received his own set of toiletries, his own books, and, most unbelievable of all, his own key to the house. School was the next hurdle. Elijah had never been to a real school before. He had spent years slipping through the cracks, avoiding authorities, surviving day by day. The idea of sitting in a classroom, surrounded by kids who had grown up in normal homes, made his stomach churn. But Henry was unwavering. "You're going," he said. No arguments. The first day was brutal. Elijah felt like an alien, out of place among students who had never known hunger, never fought for a warm place to sleep. The teachers were kind but cautious, their voices gentle as if they expected him to break. Some of the kids whispered about him, the charity case, the street kid that Winston brought home. But Elijah was tougher than he looked. He ignored the whispers, pushed through the stairs, and focused on what mattered. Learning. Growing. Proving, if only to himself, that he belonged. Henry never asked about school, but every evening, at precisely 7 p.m., they would sit at the dinner table together. Sometimes they ate in silence. Other times, Henry would offer a brief comment about his day, expecting nothing in return. It was strange. Unfamiliar. But it was something. And as the weeks passed, something even stranger happened. Elijah started to feel safe. He stopped flinching at sudden noises. He no longer hid extra food in his pockets, fearing it would be his last meal. He slept without waking up in panic, without the constant fear that someone would take everything away. For the first time in his life, he let his guard down. And Henry? Henry Winston, the man who once built walls around his heart, found those walls slowly, inexplicably crumbling. Because against all odds, without him realizing it, a bond was forming. One that neither of them would ever be able to walk away from, unraveling the past. The sky darkened over the Winston estate, painting the city skyline in hues of deep indigo and amber. Inside the mansion, the rhythmic tapping of Henry Winston's pen against his desk filled the quiet study. It was an old habit, one that surfaced only when something troubled him. For the first time in years, Henry found himself distracted. Not by work, not by business, but by a boy. Elijah had been with him for months now, and the changes were impossible to ignore. At first, he had been like a shadow, barely speaking, always watching, as if waiting for everything to be taken away. But little by little, he had started to settle, his posture relaxed, his voice more confident, his trust, fragile but growing. Yet, Henry sensed something still lingered beneath the surface. Something unresolved. Something Elijah wasn't saying. A restless night. The clock read 2:37 a.m. when Henry stirred awake. A sound, soft, barely perceptible, had pierced the silence of the house. Sitting up, he strained his ears. Then he heard it again. A faint rustling, the shuffle of movement, coming from down the hallway. Henry rose, slipping on a robe as he stepped out of his bedroom. The corridor was dimly lit, shadows stretching long against the polished floors. He followed the sound until he reached the boy's room. The door was slightly ajar. Pushing it open further, Henry's gaze fell upon Elijah, crouched on the floor beside his bed. The boy was stuffing small items into a worn-out backpack, a few pieces of clothing, a water bottle, and tucked underneath his jacket, a loaf of bread from the kitchen. He was running away. Elijah. The boy froze. Henry leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Going somewhere? Elijah's breathing was shallow, his fingers gripping the backpack straps. His mind raced, calculating an escape route, an excuse, anything. I was just. Henry raised a brow. Just what? Elijah swallowed hard. He had been careful, waiting for the right night, making sure the house was quiet. But now, caught in the act, he couldn't hide the truth. He exhaled sharply, eyes darting downward. I don't belong here. Henry studied him, his voice calm but firm. Who told you that? Elijah let out a bitter laugh. I don't need anyone to tell me. I just know. Silence stretched between them. Then, Henry stepped forward and, without a word, sat down on the floor beside him. Elijah tensed, unsure of what to expect. But Henry just rested his elbows on his knees, gazing straight ahead. I grew up in a house where I never belonged either, Henry said after a moment. Elijah turned slightly, hesitant. This was new. Henry never talked about himself. My father left when I was 10, Henry continued, his voice steady, but something unreadable flickered in his expression. My mother, well, she was never really there, even when she was. I spent most of my childhood in a house that wasn't a home. Elijah frowned. He had never thought about Henry's past before. He had just assumed the man had always been this, wealthy, powerful, untouchable. But I survived, Henry went on. And I built a life where I didn't have to rely on anyone. At least, that's what I thought. Elijah shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't sure where this was going, but something about Henry's tone made him pause. Henry turned to look at him then. You think you don't belong here? That I'm just doing this out of obligation or guilt? Elijah stayed silent. You're wrong. Elijah blinked, startled. Henry exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. I didn't bring you here because I had to. I brought you here because I saw something in you, something I recognize in myself. He locked eyes with the boy. You're a survivor, Elijah. And for the first time in my life, I don't want to survive alone. Something lodged in Elijah's throat, a weight pressing against his chest. He wanted to believe him. He really did. But trust, real trust, wasn't built in a day. And deep down, the fear still whispered, what if he changes his mind? What if one day, he decides I'm not worth it? Henry must have seen the hesitation in his eyes, because his next words came slow, deliberate. I can't promise that I'll always say the right thing, or that I'll be perfect at this. He gestured between them. But I can promise that I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you. Elijah felt his fingers tighten around the backpack straps. The fight in him, the instinct to run, warred against something deeper, a yearning. A desperate yearning to believe in something good. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Elijah inhaled shakily, dropping his gaze. Slowly, hesitantly, he pushed the backpack aside. He wasn't ready to say the words. Not yet. But for the first time, he wasn't ready to leave either. Cracks in the armor. The following weeks were different. Henry noticed the shift, subtle, but there. Elijah no longer avoided eye contact as much. He didn't flinch when Henry stood too close. He even started sitting at the dinner table before being called. It was slow, fragile progress. Then, one evening, the real breakthrough happened. Henry had been in his study when he heard it, a knock. Not the hesitant, obligatory kind. A real knock. Come in. Elijah poked his head inside, his expression unreadable. Can I ask you something? Henry set down his paperwork. Go ahead. The boy hesitated, then stepped in fully. His hands were stuffed in his hoodie pocket, shoulders tense. You know everything about me, he mumbled. But I don't really know anything about you. Henry was taken aback. Elijah had never asked personal questions before. Henry leaned back in his chair. What do you want to know? Elijah shrugged. Dunno. Anything. Henry considered for a moment. Then, a small smirk tugged at his lips. All right. Here's something. When I was 12, I got caught sneaking into a movie theater. Elijah's eyes widened. You? Henry chuckled. Yep. Didn't have the money, so I found another way in. Elijah's lips twitched. Did you get caught? Oh, absolutely, Henry said, shaking his head. The manager chased me out, but I was too fast for him. Elijah let out a small laugh, a real one. Henry's smirk grew. Your turn. Elijah hesitated, but then, almost shyly, he admitted, I once stole an entire pizza. Henry raised a brow. An entire pizza? Elijah nodded. It was from this shop near downtown. The guy turned around for like 2 seconds, and he made a quick snatching motion. Gone. Henry chuckled. You're lucky you weren't caught. Elijah shrugged. Yeah, but I shared it. There were some other kids I knew. They were hungry too. Henry's amusement softened into something else. The kid had nothing, yet he had still shared. That was when Henry realized, Elijah wasn't just surviving. He was protecting others too. And that was something no amount of money could buy. For the first time, Henry understood. Elijah wasn't just a lost boy in need of saving. He was family. And that changed everything. A truth that changes everything. The rain lashed against the wide glass windows of the Winston estate, its rhythmic drumming filling the silence between them. Henry sat at the dining table, eyes following the boy across the room. Elijah was different now. There was more confidence in the way he moved, more trust in the way he spoke. But something still lingered, a shadow in his eyes. Henry had spent a lifetime reading people. It was a skill that had made him one of the most formidable businessmen in the country. And right now, his instincts told him that Elijah was hiding something. "Sit down," Henry said, his voice steady but firm. Elijah hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly before he finally dropped into the seat across from him. Henry folded his hands together. "There's something I need to ask you." The boy's expression didn't change, but his posture stiffened, a sign. Henry exhaled, choosing his words carefully. "Ever since you came here, I've noticed you watching me." Elijah's jaw tightened. "It's not just curiosity, is it?" Henry pressed. Silence. Then, finally, Elijah let out a slow breath. His eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto Henry's. "I know who you are," he said quietly. Henry frowned. "Of course, you do." Elijah shook his head. "No. I mean, I know who you really are." Henry's breath hitched, but he kept his face neutral. He wasn't a man who reacted easily. But something about the way Elijah said it, so certain, so absolute, sent an unease through him. "Elijah," Henry said cautiously, "what are you talking about?" The boy clenched his fists. "You don't recognize me, do you?" Henry's frown deepened. He studied the boy's face, the sharpness of his jaw, the deep-set eyes. There was something vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. "No," Henry admitted, "should I?" Elijah swallowed hard. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "My mother worked for you." Henry's breath stilled. No. It couldn't be. But before he could speak, Elijah continued. Her name was Jasmine Carter. Henry's world tilted. The woman in the past. Jasmine Carter. The name struck him like a physical blow. Memories, ones he had long buried, surfaced like a tidal wave. She had been one of his most loyal employees. A woman with a sharp mind, unshakable work ethic, and a warmth that had set her apart from the cold world of business. She had worked as his executive assistant for 5 years before suddenly quitting without a word. Henry had always found it strange. Jasmine had been dedicated to her job. She never once hinted that she was unhappy. Then, one day, she was just gone. No explanation. No farewell. Nothing. He had assumed she had moved on, found something better, maybe even started a family. But now, he was looking at her son. And the truth hit him like a freight train. Buried secrets come to light. Elijah, Henry's voice was hoarse. Your mother, she left. Elijah let out a hollow laugh. She didn't leave. His gaze burned with something Henry had never seen before, pain, anger, betrayal. Henry's stomach twisted. Then, what happened? Elijah's hands trembled slightly. He closed his eyes for a moment before speaking. She was fired. The word struck Henry harder than he expected. He leaned forward. That's not possible. I never. It wasn't you, Elijah said bitterly. It was your board. Some of your executives. Henry's pulse pounded. Why? Elijah exhaled sharply. Because she refused to do what they wanted. They wanted her to lie. To sign off on paperwork that covered up a real estate deal that would have ruined hundreds of families. She wouldn't do it. Henry's mind raced. He had built his empire on power, precision, and ruthless business tactics. But he had always ensured that he never crossed the line. If his executives had fired Jasmine for standing up to corruption, he had never known. He had never looked. She begged them to let her stay, Elijah continued, voice raw. She told them she had a son to feed. But they didn't care. They blacklisted her, Henry. No one in the corporate world would touch her after that. A sick feeling coiled in Henry's gut. How had he never known? He had been so focused on profits, expansion, power, that he had missed what was happening right under his nose. And now, the son of the woman he failed was sitting across from him. Elijah, Henry whispered, guilt pressing down on his chest, I didn't know. The boy shook his head. Doesn't matter. It happened. Henry swallowed the lump in his throat. Where is she now? Elijah's expression darkened. She's gone. Henry's heart dropped. She died 2 years ago, Elijah said, voice breaking for the first time. She got sick. Couldn't afford the right treatment. His hands curled into fists. All because of what happened at your company. Henry felt like the air had been punched from his lungs. For all his wealth, all his power, he had failed the one person who had stood by him. And her son had paid the price. A debt that could never be repaid. The silence between them was heavy. Henry wanted to fix it. He wanted to say something that would erase the pain in the boy's eyes. But no amount of money, no apology, could change the past. After a long moment, he spoke. Elijah. His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly. I can't undo what happened. I can't bring her back. But I can promise you this, I will make it right. Elijah's expression didn't change. You can't bring her back, he repeated. Henry nodded. No. But I can make sure that the people who did this to her are held accountable. And I can make sure you never have to struggle again. Elijah's lips pressed into a thin line. I don't want your money. Henry exhaled. He had expected that. But then Elijah said something that surprised him. If you really want to make it right, his gaze was steady, unwavering. Help me finish what she started. Henry's brows furrowed. What do you mean? Elijah took a deep breath. My mom didn't just fight for herself. She fought for people like her, people who got crushed by powerful men who never even noticed them. Henry did notice now. And suddenly, he understood. Elijah wasn't looking for revenge. He was looking for justice. Henry nodded, something shifting deep within him. Then let's do it. Elijah studied him carefully, as if testing his sincerity. Then, slowly, he gave the smallest nod. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start.